work around Australia and New Zealand, and recently Vietnam, with a lot of large enterprise clients. And obviously AI being the hot topic of the last 2 or 3 years, I think it is now. We write a lot of software, and it's really important to us that we can write software fast and I guess to a high quality, and how we leverage sort of agentic coding, we'll call it today, is really important, because you can write, you can vibe code up something really fun and that's awesome, but to kind of make it sort of enterprise grade, if you will, and sort of align it with business context, business rules, technical requirements, things, is a whole other bag of fish. So I will talk through one of the common sort of patterns or tool sets that I use. It centers around a tool called Cline, which is an open source free VS Code extension. I usually connect it up to the Claude series of models, occasionally Google Gemini 2.5 Pro as well, but I find that the Claude Sonnet, particularly 4 models, do a high quality sort of output. So I'll talk through today some agent rules, some agent tools, and some agent workflows, which are basically just prompt templates or repeatable patterns. I'll just start really, really quickly, and I promise there's no slide deck, just why it matters, because I think the why is really, really important. When we drive down costs for customers, or if I'm developing a tool for myself and I want it to not take all week, we can do so with agentic coding. And this is a pretty representative sample of the kind of like time or cost savings you can achieve when enabled with the right tools, right models, and you sort of cut your chops on getting a little bit sort of up to speed with how these things work. So if we took like a front-end redevelopment project, say Angular JS to React JS project that was going to be about 31 dev days or 50K estimate, something like that. Generally, we're seeing a cut down to about 11 days or 17K. That's a massive, massive saving. And just like that, one bit of information alone should make you interested in how you can do this. There's many different ways you can do this. But today, yeah, I'll focus on Cline. We use Cline a lot because a lot of our customers in the enterprise space either have strong, I guess, security requirements, things like not using public APIs, but, OpenAI or whatever, right? So they want all inference, all data to remain within their private cloud. It's a really, really common thing you'll see in the enterprise. And a lot of them, you think banks and insurance often can't even use offshore models. So let's have a look at agent rules. So you can think of rules as sort of like guiding principles. In VS Code, Cline looks a bit like, let's get this distraction down. Here we go. Cline looks a bit like any other sort of AI coding agent sort of panel that pops up on the right here. But it's not the same as Copilot or Amazon Q or any of those. It doesn't even do tab complete 2.0, like a lot of the Copilots do. It's very focused on agentic coding or sort of goal-oriented programming. So in this interface on the right, I'll just show you a couple of rules. Rules, as I said earlier, are sort of like the guiding principles. I tend to write my rules in XML, or a lot of them in XML or pseudo XML, which seems weird at first, but turns out AI coding models, or AI models in general, are heavily trained on structured data. And a great way to sort of reinforce that an AI model should use your rules, or they should be applied in a certain scenario, is providing them a bit of structure. And pseudo XML can really help with that. We've tried it both with and without, and it does make a big difference. The kind of things that I'll put into coding rules might be around, enforcing testing patterns, maybe links to internal documentation, things like that. AI coding models, because they were, I guess, trained on data that might be quite out of date, they'll often write code or use package versions that were popular at the time that their training data was created. So sometimes it's worth calling out deprecated methods that you see getting used over and over and over. And when you find agents writing code. Another interesting one, I think it's kind of a slightly funny one. I spend a lot of my days replacing Zs with Ss in both code and documentation that AI writes. I think obviously because they're trained mainly on Americanized data, but that doesn't look good to clients. So I have a whole heap of rules just kind of trying to reinforce that sort of British English or international English spelling standards. Other things that I might have, things like how I like my diagrams to be created, simple things like, applying like a company's internal theme. So let's say you're working with a client, you take one of their example slide packs and you pull out like the key colors and you write some rules to make sure that any diagrams that are created, use that color scheme. It's really handy. There's a lot of other rules I can go into. I publish all of these just publicly on a GitHub repo. There was a QR code back there before, but smcleod.net, and you'll find them through my GitHub somewhere. So that
we could share that with everyone afterwards as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I try and keep it pretty up to date too. So that at a really, really high level is the rules. We often will put these in like a Git repo for a team that goes out and works with the client, and then they all kind of clone it locally, and they all have the same sort of rule sets and can contribute to it and version control it and things like that. And usually when we go out with a client, there'll be some really client-specific rules embedded in there. You can toggle them on and off in the interface here. Next thing was tools. And by tools, I don't mean Cline, like the coding tool itself, but I mean the tools you enable AI coding agents with. If we think about, what makes a good, implementation of a package or a library, might mean that you go and reference the documentation for the current or latest version of that package. It might mean that you search the internet and maybe forums and go and find out the best way to implement this, or maybe, common implementation patterns. And it might mean fetching pages from the internet in a way that's effective or efficient for AI models to sort of grok. And that's often, marked down without all the HTML tags and things like that. So in here, there's a bunch of MCP, Model Context Protocol, which is the standard for integrating AI, large language models with external data sources and integrations. Bunch of servers. One of them I'll show you, which I wrote here, which I just called DevTools, really exciting sort of name. So if we have a look at DevTools, in here, it provides just a common set of functions that I use day in, day out for software development. So things like checking what the latest Docker tag is on a Docker repository, checking the latest GitHub Actions versions, Golang package versions, things like that. And you can have things like front-end component templates. So maybe you're using, say, ShadCN, or maybe you're using Tailwind CSS or something like that. It's quite easy to add a tool that has sort of predefined templates for that. So you can say, hey, create me a widget that does X, and it will go and use that tool and sort of implement it in a repeatable way. So that at a really high level is tools, and I'll show how they're actually used in practice shortly. The other thing is workflows. It's a bit of a weird name, but basically it's prompt templates. It makes it sound more complicated than it really is. So prompt templates can be, local to a repo or a project. It can be global on your machine. And when it is global on your machine, often, again, we'll store them in a Git repo and make them available across a team that's deployed out to a client. The kind of things that I might have in those templates, this is a good example one. Maybe I'll make that a bit bigger so you can read it. So this prompt template basically is, imagine a scenario where I'm working with a coding agent and I've defined some requirements to, say, redevelop or develop some software. Let's say it is going from Angular to React or whatever, right? So I've gone backwards and forwards with the coding agent, sort of teasing out the technical and business requirements and stuff. And I'm at that point where, okay, great, I've probably filled up the working memory, the context of that model, and I want this to be maybe peer reviewed by, my team members. So I need to have it in a repeatable format. So I have a template that goes and basically instructs the model to create a phased checklist of tasks along with any contextual information that might be useful for other coding agents or the same coding agent to carry out that development. And this one here basically does it. Basically, it's just a prompt that tells it how to do that. It gives a little example of the kind of layout that I like. And so when I trigger that on an existing conversation, the agent will then go and create that plan, hopefully. Another really, really simple one here that I just wrote for this demo, which was upgrade dependencies. Now, this is really boring. You should have software that goes and updates your dependencies all the time. But we know that sometimes when we're developing software, particularly in a front-end repo, let's say, you'll come across a bunch of out-of-date dependencies. And it's really nice if you can get your coding agent to go and update those as part of the work it's doing, rather than you having to down tools. So this one here, I've simply said, start by reading the code base, create a diagram outlining the code base, like the components, check for outdated packages and identify security vulnerabilities. Just say there, never use an AI to tell you if your code is secure or not. Please use deterministic tools for that. But it can go and look at things like your tools, like security tools, like Sneak or Checkmarks or whatever, and use that for sort of a more informed report. And then create a development plan, similar to that one I showed before, but a lot simpler. So when I trigger that, what is this? Update deps. A bit smaller again. So the first thing it does is it goes off and it loads up the model with all the contextual information. It gives the model things like a list or file tree of all the files in your repo, and then gives it this prompt at the end. And so the agent's now said it needs to understand the code base. It needs to, look at the current dependencies. It needs to create a diagram of the current components. So it's going through and it's reading the different files in the file tree. It's done things like read the index, read some TypeScript, maybe the TS config for how it's configured, having a look at some tests. This is where it gets interesting. So this is making a tool call. So this is using my DevTools MCP server here. And what it's done is it's passed in all the current package versions to that tool. That tool just in software, because software is way more efficient than AI models, has gone and just fetched the latest current stable package versions, and it's returned them to the AI model. So in sense, what you've done is augmented the model's knowledge with up-to-date information. And that could be a private package repository for things that aren't published on the internet, which is a common pattern with clients. So now that the agent knows the up-to-date information, it's going and it's writing this implementation plan, which is part of that original prompt that I put in. Go through and it will create a phased checklist of tasks. So I asked it to create a mermaid diagram. I find this interesting, helpful. Sometimes you'll maybe you've got a Jira card and you'll throw it in, or you'll get the agent to update the Jira card with a diagram of how it understands the repo. It's identified the key, upgrade paths for different packages. So some security considerations. I know that it can use VS Code's inbuilt security and error checking, basic tree shaking within the IDE, and it's pulled that information back, and then it's written out these development phases. This is really, really important. I say to people all the time, please spend much more time in planning your software to redevelopment or development than you do in actually developing it. If you're going to put in a little simple prompt that says, hey, make sure everything's up to date and it's great, you probably, a lot of the time, you're not going to get a really good quality outcome. But by getting a model enabled with tools to go through programmatically almost through your repo, outline a really structured, detailed brief, you can then take this and you can say to another AI coding agent or the same coding agent, hey, go and implement phase 1. So at this point here, when it's created this document, usually the first thing I do is I go through and I review it. And there quite often will be things that I don't want. Perhaps it's going down some testing strategy I don't like and I'll need to change that out. Or perhaps one of my rules hasn't really taken effect and I want to tweak those a bit more. But let's just say I'll just go with what is suggested here. Now, this could be a whole new session. It could be a different developer actually, taking this up. But let's just say to the existing coding agent, let's go begin the work in phase 1, right? Really simple stuff. So because it's written this document, it already knows what's there. If I was to provide it to another agent, I could say, read the development plan and begin phase 1. That's simple. So it's gone through, it's automatically updated all the dependencies there that are related to phase 1 anyway. It knows that it's a TypeScript or JavaScript project, so it's done an npm install of the packages. And again, those are the package versions that the tool previously returned as the current stable or latest versions. It's implementing maybe some best practices here in the TypeScript configuration. Might also be requirements for the new TypeScript versions. If you've got a really complex upgrade, often I'll say something like, go away and research any deprecated methods or functionality between the major versions so that it goes off, it maybe does some research online, pulls back information about, that upgrade path and then augments its capabilities. So it's just gone up and run up the little application, little demo application here. And you can see that it's actually got an inbuilt embedded web browser built into Cline. And it's going to load that up in just a second. And it's going to do some exploratory testing. So it's going to click around. What's really nice about having this embedded browser with multimodal models is that it can click on elements in the page and it gets access to the JavaScript console in that embedded browser. So you're not just relying on the code itself looking like things will work, but you can actually visually check that things work. You can obviously inspect the screenshots as it's going through clicking on things. and it can react to any, JavaScript console errors, let's say. Let's say it's found some, it would go back and it would fix those autonomously, hopefully. And then it goes through, and the last thing it does, because of that prompt I gave it earlier, is update that phase one to check off all the tasks. Now, I will say there, this is what it thinks it's completed. At the end of the day, AI models are prediction engines, and they're only ever going to be as good as the inputs you give them, their training data, and you as an engineer providing guidance and review the whole way, end to end. So that's the most simple demo I could think of to kind of show how this works. It's a pretty boring demo because it's just simply upgrading some packages. But you can imagine that in the enterprise, when you want to align this with, say, private package repositories, with security requirements, architectural knowledge, going back to that, where is that little yeah. Maybe you've got it integrated with your Confluence, and it can search Confluence, retrieve a relevant chunk of information. Let's say it's an architectural guideline or a change management process. We all love filling those out. And then augment the model's capabilities, the agent's capabilities, becomes a really powerful pattern. And if you implement it, all I say is, please don't tell anyone it's autopilot. It's not autopilot. It's more like having a couple of, peers that you can delegate tasks to accelerate your development.
So just jumping in here, Sam, that's really, really cool. I just want to remind everyone listening, you can submit questions, so please feel free to do that. And maybe just to kind of get the question started, I wanted to ask you, Sam, like, why Cline? Like, and what other agentic systems did you consider?
Yeah, lots. So in my role, so I'm focused both internally and across a lot of clients, working on, I guess, the area of accelerating and enabling engineers, and it's developers, platform engineers, QA test, and a little bit of BA as well now, with access to tools, models, patterns, and workflows, all AI related. Part of that is I do a lot of R&D with other members. So we test out, there's a new cool tool that comes out. We'll go and test it out and see, is it good in general? How can it be applied to the enterprise? What are the risks? What's the performance like? How long does it take to come up to speed? We keep coming back to Cline is a
Mm.
funny one. It's open source, so a lot of organizations like it because they can go through the code base, they can verify that it's secure, it's not sending data off overseas or whatever. Everything can stay within your virtual private cloud. So it goes to your private Bedrock or GCP
Mm.
Vertex instance. No data leaves your environment. And that's really powerful. Like we've used
Yeah.
things like Cursor and Roo Code and Windsurf and you name it. We do use agentic frameworks like Pro AI, small agents quite a bit for more complex
Mhm.
tasks. But yeah, Cline's been really, really solid.
That's great, and we're going to see some other tools from GoGo and from Grant, but maybe we'll do one or two questions, and then we'll switch over to Grant, and then I would encourage you, Sam, if you can type some answers while to your questions that have come in while we're going, that'd be great. But I think this one's really good to do live. It's what's the workflow for sharing the development plans generated by Cline to the rest of your team? Do you just check it into Git, or are you connecting to Jira? That's from Tabish.
Yeah, connecting to Jira is an interesting one. Yeah, we do have some tools that we connect to Jira, mainly for things like task decomposition. So you think connect to Jira, get an epic, and then accelerate, chunking it up into manageable tasks. I think the whole way that we develop and deliver software with tasks and Scrum and all those painful things is going to change really rapidly anyway. But quite often we'll just share them. The simplest way is honestly just a Git repo. Just commit them all to a Git repo, and then people can check them out. Sometimes people use Git submodules, and they might be like, oh, let's pull in a Git repo with a lot of good patterns for, say, front-end development, and let's also check out the one that has back-end development or a language, Golang and Java or something like that.
Makes sense.
I know that Cline are working on a centralized product for distributing workflows and rules and things. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe the last one is, and then we'll let you kind of do some type dances on the others. But from Chris, how big is your dev team, and how many people are using this process at the same time? Do you see clashes when you have multiple people doing this kind of stuff together?
Yeah, I think coming back to what I was saying before about the way that we work changing massively, that whole thing of, let's take a card down to the smallest implementable, function or whatever, one really small itemized change. I think that's going to change. I don't think I've seen anyone with the answer to that. But I think we're seeing more dev teams, the ideal team size of about 5 people or something like that, up to 11. They tend to will more focus on a specific repo's changes rather than say one small function within a repo. Um, uh, yeah, I kind of think of using Cline or any agentic coding tool a bit like, instead of being me as one engineer doing whatever work I've got to do, it's kind of like me with 2 other engineers there. So it's almost like a little
Mhm.
team of 3 working on a repo. And at the moment, I think carving it up by repository makes it a lot easier. But if you define in your plan stage really well